there seems to be a bit of excitement that the UK is somewhat peeling ahead of other Western nations in terms of how willing they are to give Ukraine kit that it can use to directly attack Russia. I mean, to your mind, what is actually going on there?
Ukraine has been really trying to ratchet up the pain level for the Russians during this summer with long range strikes. Now, a lot of these use what are in effect big model aeroplanes, drones so called with explosive warheads. And they fly pretty slowly. I mean, they can be in the air for 2 hours going from somewhere in Ukraine to somewhere deep in Russia. But they've been doing a lot of that this summer. But they also want the ability to hit targets that are in the few hundreds of kilometers away from where they would be launched, with something that goes much faster and hits much harder. So the Storm Shadow is distinctive because it's launched from an aeroplane. It flies much faster. It's nearly at the speed of sound than some of these drones, which complicates the Russians' defense against them. And it can, zigzag around. It can try and avoid Russian defensive systems, all that stuff. And when it hits the target, it does so with greater force because it's got it's got a warhead which has a first element which is designed, if you like, to break in, and then a second element which is the main explosive charge. Now, you might think, well, what's that for, or why did they design it that way? And the answer simply is things like bunker busting. So if, for example, you're hitting an air base deep in Russia, you might use some of those other drones that the Ukrainians have got to hit the aeroplanes when they're parked beside the airfield, because they are relatively soft things, aeroplanes, or fragile things. And if you create a large explosion on or very near them, you can damage or destroy them. But if those aeroplanes have been put inside what are called hardened shelters, so it's a hangar with concrete roof and walls, or indeed you're trying to hit the command center at that airbase, then the Storm Shadow is a much more effective weapon.
Yes, and they've already used it, we should say, in Russian occupied Crimea. So it has already hit, quote unquote, Russian territory.
Britain is enthusiastically backing Ukraine's case to use these. President Biden is a lot less enthusiastic about letting that happen. And yes, are they crossing a Rubicon? Because as you've just said, these missiles, originally they're a French design. So the French have also sent a very similar missile called Scalp, as well as a Storm Shadow. So both types have been used against Ukraine. Now, if you're a red-blooded Russian nationalist, you regard Crimea, I beg your pardon, where they've been used, as just as much a part of Russia as, Voronezh or Murmansk or, any other provincial part of Russia. Now, clearly to Ukrainians, it's occupied land. But this idea that, if you take one step over the line into Russia proper, you're going to cross a whole set of Rubicons and red lines and all the rest of it, has obviously been eroded because, yes, many targets have been hit in Crimea with all sorts of weapons. And many targets have now been hit across the borders in Russia itself with certain weapons like the artillery missile system called HIMARS. And also, of course, with all these, literally hundreds in the last few months, of these Ukrainian drones. Now, the politics of this, if you're sitting in Washington, is that no, it's quite different to use something supplied by the West to something made in Ukraine, like those drones. And President Putin himself, seemingly working away on that uncertainty, on that political difference, of course, has made his statement a couple of days ago that no, if you use these missiles, because NATO satellites are required to gather the intelligence and the terrain information that are fed into these missiles to guide them. That requires NATO service men and women, I mean, it's interesting. I think he's probably right about that. Once you're doing that, well, you're sort of waging war on Russia directly.
Yes, but is all this inevitable? Because to my uninitiated, undiplomatic mind, it seems like just the next step in a continuing conveyor belt. We had the argument over tanks, we had the arguments over fighter jets, we're now having the argument over Storm Shadow, and it seems like we all know it will happen eventually. It's just they feel like they need to go through the motions, or there's a long period of reflection.
I think there's different ways of looking at this. The first is that a good deal of Western leadership. I mean, we've talked about President Biden, but if you look at Olaf Scholz in Germany, even more so, has been very reluctant to take steps which they believe would bring closer the possibility of war with Russia, between Russia and Western countries, not between Russia and Ukraine. Now, of course, President Putin has worked away at that anxiety and tried to exploit it. Some people call it self-deterrence by the Western countries, that they've talked themselves into a situation where they won't do certain things because President Putin has made certain threats. But at the back of it all is this nagging uncertainty. If you get this wrong, and we do actually trigger some kind of open conflict with Russia, I guess that's a place where a lot of people don't want to be. Now, the enthusiastic backers of Ukraine say, oh, well, the Russians would soon get smashed, by NATO. And in many ways, given the difficulty they've had with Ukraine, to then have a war with NATO as well would clearly be disastrous for Russia. But I think the problem is this: it's the nuclear threshold. And it's quite interesting that, as this debate has been going on, the weekend before last, we had the head of the CIA in London giving a talk in which he revealed that in the summer of 2022, the late summer, Septemberish, I think, this sort of time of year, when things were going very badly wrong for the Russians, when the Ukrainians were retaking a big section of the east of the country, that serious preparations were detected by American intelligence to use Russian nuclear weapons. But I mean, it's that kind of thing which I think causes President Biden to be cautious.
I'm Manveen Rana from The Story, a daily news podcast from The Times. Join me and my co-host Luke Jones for a deep dive into the big stories and investigations. Plus, each month, William Hague hosts an agenda-setting interview with a key newsmaker or big thinker. That's The Story, The Times daily podcast that brings you one remarkable story told in depth. Listen every weekday on The Times radio app or wherever you get your podcasts.